Shalom, everyone, to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's Parsha coming up is Vaeira, and the Haftorah comes from the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel, the 28th chapter, 25th verse, into the 29th chapter. Before we begin an explanation of why was this Haftorah chosen, let's just say a few things about Ezekiel. We already had one Haftorah from Ezekiel. That was in Parshat Vayigash, where it's one of the most important and beautiful prophecies, where God commands Ezekiel to take two sticks and write on one of them Yehuda and the other one Ephraim, and to bring the sticks together. This was at the time there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and it was two different kingdoms. Israel was no longer a unified nation. And God comes to Ezekiel and says, put them together as a promise that eventually they will be brought together. Ezekiel was a Cohen, and he was taken. He lived at the same time as Jeremiah. The difference is because he was a Cohen and he was among what's called the upper classes, Nebuchadnezzar, 10 years before he destroyed the temple, took 3,000 captives back to Babylonia, and Ezekiel was one of them. And 10 years later, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple. But Ezekiel had already been taken. Jeremiah lived through the destruction of the temple, but they were prophesying at the same time. And the book of Ezekiel is full of archetypal, meaningful prophecies. The workings of the chariot, the opening of the book of Ezekiel, the Haftorah that I just explained, the wars of Gog and Magog at the end of the exile, leading to Mashiach coming, the vision of the valley of dry bones. All of this is in Ezekiel. But as an introduction to this week's Haftorah, we see that a quarter of the book of Ezekiel is he's prophesying about or against other nations that surround Israel. And that is the context of the Haftorah for this week. We always look for the connection. What is the connection between the Haftorah and the Parsha? So obviously we're in the Parsha where Israel are slaves in Egypt. And in this week's Parsha begins the 10 plagues, the first 7 of the 10 plagues. And so in this Haftorah, first of all, it begins with just a beautiful end of the exile, meaning before Mashiach comes kind of prophecy, where it says that Ezekiel says in God's name, when I gather in the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and I shall be sanctified by them in the eyes of the nations, and they shall dwell on their land that I give to my servant to Jacob. Then they shall dwell upon it securely and execute judgment and build houses and plant vineyards and dwell securely. When I execute judgments upon those who disdain them round about, they shall know that I am Hashem, their God. That's how the Haftorah begins. But then Ezekiel becomes more connected to his time, and he prophesizes against Egypt, but not the Egypt of the slavery, and not the Egypt at the end of days, the Egypt that existed at the time of Ezekiel. And at that point, Nebuchadnezzar was conquering the whole Middle East. And Israel had depended on Egypt for some kind of support to try to fend off Nebuchadnezzar. So in this Haftorah, Ezekiel makes clear to Israel that that is not a good idea. It's a bad policy because Egypt is not a nation to depend on. Not before and not then. And here, 2 times in this Haftorah, he describes the king of Egypt, and it's very similar to the Pharaoh. But here again, this is the Egypt of Ezekiel's time. And it says like this. It says, Ko amar Hashem Elokim hineni alecha Paro melech Mitzrayim. God says, I am against you, Pharaoh. But here again, he's talking about the king at that time, the king of Egypt, the great sea serpent. He calls the Pharaoh a great sea serpent. Harovetz betocha yorav, who lives in the Nile River. Asher amar li yaori ba'ani asitani. This is the river that Pharaoh says, this is my river and I have created it, meaning I am God. And so Ezekiel is talking to the Jewish people, but he's also talking to the Egyptians and saying, what chutzpah? You, the river is yours and you created it? You will be destroyed. And the Ezekiel goes on and explains that Nebuchadnezzar, he is going to come and wipe you out. And that is exactly what happened. Nebuchadnezzar, not only did he destroy the temple and take captives from Israel, but he also destroyed Egypt. And here, as I mentioned before, a quarter of the book of Ezekiel, he's prophesying against these other nations and also telling them what is going to happen to them. And then a second time later on, he says the same thing. He describes the king of Egypt as this sea serpent who claims that I have created the Nile and I am God. And so here it's really a double message. And this is very, very connected to the plagues, that the plagues were against Egypt, but they were also showing Israel the power of God and that he was going to fulfill his promise of taking them out of Egypt. When Moshe came back in the book, in the Parsha of Shemot, and he goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I don't know your God, and I'm going to even make the work harder on the people. And here, so the people, like, they were so excited. Moshe's back. He's coming to redeem us. God is going to redeem us. And the next thing they know, the work is harder than ever. And so the plagues were also a message to Israel and a message to the Egyptians. And the Haftorah ends, V'yomahu atzmiach keren lebeit Yisrael. Now, again, he's talking about the future. One of the devices we see in all of the words of the prophets, the use of time is very, very fluid. A prophet within a number of verses can be talking about the past, the present, and the future. They kind of all meld together. So at the end of this Haftorah, again, it begins with this prophecy of the future when Mashiach comes. And it ends also with the prophecy of Mashiach of the end of days and the final redemption. In the middle, he's talking very, very much about the very Egypt of the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and when Israel is destroyed and Egypt is destroyed, and he's warning Israel, don't depend on Egypt. They're not going to be able to save you from Nebuchadnezzar. Only if you change your ways and create a society based on morals and ethics and the Torah, and that is what will save you from Nebuchadnezzar. Egypt will not save you, but it ends. B'yomahu atzmiach keren lebeit Yisrael u'lecha eten pitchon peh b'torcham v'yedu ki ani Hashem. So it says that on that day, meaning in the future, I will cause strength of the house of Israel to flower. Redemption will come like a flower and will open up. And to you, I will grant a vindication in the midst of the nations, and they shall know that I am Hashem. So this idea, they shall know that I am Hashem, if you look at the 10 plagues, almost every time when Moshe goes in to Pharaoh and warns him that if you don't let the people go, the next plague is going to come. And he, almost in every plague, he introduces it by saying, and through this plague, you will know that God is God. But he says it in different ways. There's no God in the earth. You will know that there is God. There is no one like God. But it's all to know. And so here we end the Haftorah, which is connected to the Parsha, that in the future, everyone will know about the one God. May we live and see it soon and in our days.